Hey, adventurers. So listen, today's adventure is one of the best that I can imagine, and that is going from being angry to less angry. And who among us does not have anger issues that we could conceivably deal with? No matter how peaceful we are, there's always more peace to be had. And when we're truly angry, like yours truly had been, then these strategies are glorious. And so I can't imagine that I'd be able to go through all of the component parts of what I'm going to share with you and not make mistakes, maybe be pissed off by the mistake, and having to redo it because I'm already, like, I don't know, 35 minutes into the video, and I don't have editing equipment or the skills to pull it off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this in increments, and hopefully my web guy Dylan can put them all together in a way that is more palatable to you, my viewing audience of, I don't know, 3 people or whatever it is. So, yeah. All right. So this is a combination of some stuff that's called rational emotive behavioral therapy, or REBT for short. And this is coming from a guy named Albert Ellis, which is, not quite Mount Rushmore of therapists, but, certainly second tier below guys like Freud and Jung. And, I don't know if you are familiar with psychology, Maslow, Skinner, those guys. I mean, he's probably right around in that group too, but in any case, doesn't matter how famous he is or that I can drop names. What matters is that I give some background information regarding where this comes from, because I've always found it to be a little bit more palatable that way. And so I interject the principles of REBT, which, if you are going to look this up, this is the ABCs of REBT, and I'll explain what that all means. And then, Dakota's take on how to work it, and what it all means, and how we end up with anger issues. Because, some really very important thing to remember is that short of, some serious brain deficiency issues that have to do with, amygdala damage, other things that could happen, but most every child comes into this world with, no anger issues. I mean, so the question to ask ourselves, or ask yourself if you're angry, is why is it that a person has anger issues? If that's you, why do you have anger issues where other people don't? And, it is much more powerful to be able to talk to a client and have them sort these things out than to just throw the information out at you. So, I'd kind of like to just take a second where we listen to this beautiful music and have you think about that. Why do people have anger issues? And what a whole lot of people come to as an answer for that is that, difficult things have happened to them. And yet, that's it, at least partially. But it's not the whole story, because there have been plenty of people who have bad things happen to them, and yet they do not have anger issues. So the way to think about this is that we come into the world with different dispositions, but very, very few human beings, as I said, come into the world with anger issues. We end up in the course of our lifetime filling up the container of our anger issues. So let me explain that. I like to use a container like this bottle to say, okay, so when we come into the world, let's say that this is my container as a kid, and I came in to the world, like most of us did, with an empty container. And you know this when you see any child that just has their needs met just being in the world, and they're seeing a crack in the sidewalk and, you know, weeds coming out of it, and it's like the best thing ever because they're kids, and life is just joyous. And it's our birthright, man. It's our birthright to be happy, you see. Think that we come into the world with that. But what happens is that over time, through difficulties that we encounter, we have these difficulties, and they go into our container. And what we're not taught in our culture, and not taught in most cultures, is how to process our anger and get it up out of us. What we're taught, especially in this culture, especially males in this culture, is how to shove it down inside of us. You know, if a little boy in our culture starts talking about how they're feeling this kind of a thing out with other little boys, they're going to get picked on. They're going to get, things are going to go worse for them, right? Now, our culture's getting better at this, but you know, little girls, they have a much richer emotional vocabulary as part of being female, not part of their DNA or their chromosomes, but because they are taught to have richer emotional vocabularies, and they talk to other little girls about how they're feelings, and it's an okay thing. And even if they're not talking to their little friends about how they're feeling, even if let's say they got a little doll and they're playing with the doll, and their father comes in angry, and they go, oh, you know, Daddy's mad at us, and we better stay out of his way. And you know, this is a processing that they're doing, and it does some good at getting some of this anger up out of us. Now, those of you who know me know the story that as I was coming up, there were you know, many episodes of being ripped out of my school and thrust into a new environment where, you know, it became just so difficult for me to leave friends that I stopped making deep friends. I started to, you know, be real superficial, even as a little boy, because I knew I was going to have that difficulty of being ripped out of that environment again and having to get to a new school, be picked on. Either I was going to allow for somebody to pick on me, which I learned that if that happened, then I was going to be in a lot more trouble later on because I just continued to get picked on. So I didn't care who the kid was. I didn't care how big they were. If I was picked on, I would just go off on them. I became violent as a matter of, you know, survival, as it were. And this worked for me. It didn't work to alleviate any of the anger that I had for my mother, who was the person that had wanderlust, and she dragged her kids all over the place. I would have to assume that, you know, it's hard for me to count all of the schools, but probably 17 or more by the time I was 17 years old and joined the Army. So we'll just use the idea of moving to illustrate the shoving, the upset that I had. So, you know, there's the moving, there's the new kid in school. I was a horrible student. I was angry, and I always, you know, was the class troublemaker and class clown and all of those kinds of things. And So I hated authority figures. They were the enemy. Didn't matter if it was a teacher, and further up the chain you go, principals are worse. Parents, later on cops, judges, lawyers, all that. They were all the enemy. I just kept on shoving the anger, and I realized through much therapy, I've been in hundreds of hours of therapy, at least 10 therapists, another one of those things that I have a hard time remembering because of how many there were. But in any case, I'm able to see, though, in retrospect, that by the time I was about 10 years old, we were living in Mexico at the time, and not New Mexico, but down in the interior of Mexico, circa 1970, and it was a different time, and I was picked on for being the pinche gringo, and there was no markers of the American culture there, and I felt very, very out of place, quite naturally. And so there goes all of the upset that I had, and if I'm at the top of my container of frustration tolerance that I was born with, then if you come along with just an eyedropper of piss me off, then what's going to happen? It's going to overflow. And anger management is about managing the overflow, and we want to do that. We want to do that so nobody goes to jail, nobody goes to the hospital, nobody gets divorced. To the best of our ability, we want to try to manage that seething upset that we're feeling. Though the better strategy, keep in mind, is that if there's been stuff that went into filling up this container, then doesn't it make sense perhaps that I can examine some of those things that went into this container and work towards alleviating that, getting rid of that somehow, so that if I'm able to accomplish that, then and by the way, all the while I'm saying I mean you, I mean we, each of us, right? We can get rid of some of those things that have gone into this container so that hopefully we can be down here somewhere. And this is my truth, that I live way down here somewhere, and I know the difference because, you feel it. It's, like that fish out of water thing. When you're no longer angry, oh boy, is it recognizable, And it takes a lot to get me upset. Now, not everybody might agree with me about that, but, only I know how easily I got upset. Well, nobody else does. And, some of the things that I respond to, I know that it's important for me to talk them out now so that I don't shove them and that the container doesn't fill up. Well, because and since most people wait until they're a certain level of upset before verbalizing their anger, this is often interpreted as, oh, well, you must be very, very upset. No, that's not how it works. I'm verbalizing my upset so that I don't get really, really upset, as odd as that may sound. But so anyway, this is a very, very valuable concept to hold on to. And also it's important to know that no matter how angry we may be, that there's a little bit of play. There's room every day. Nobody's, well, I won't say nobody. I suppose that there are people who are like at tipping point anger all day, every day, but they're probably in prison or probably in mental institutions. So those people who are walking around, even if they have anger issues, have moments where they aren't angry because there's play in here. And what I mean by play, and listen, when I share all of the stuff that I share, it's either solidly researched, or if it's anecdotal or something that I've come up with on my own, I will let you know that. But so this example that I'm using is metaphor for things that have been heavily researched, and this is one of them. That what research shows is that on a day-to-day basis, and not 24 hours, but as our life goes on, what happens is that we have what the neuroscientists like to use a metaphor of a bank account, an emotional bank account. And there are things that cost out of this emotional bank account. And so some of the things that cost out of this emotional bank account are stress, obviously, pain. If anybody has experienced having pain, they know that it's harder to not be upset if somebody is coming at them with something that is upsetting. Discomfort, self-discipline. It costs out of the bank account. And the thing about self-discipline, though, it has a very strong rebound effect in as much as when we are stressed by something, when we are exercising self-discipline, for example, if I'm trying to quit smoking, this is an exercise of self-discipline. This is going to cost me out of my bank account. Anybody that's ever tried to quit something and it's a struggle for them knows that in all likelihood they're going to be easily or at least more easily upset because it's taxing to the system to have self-discipline being exercised. The rebound of it is that when we do this on a regular basis, we get stronger over time. So it's like if you lift a weight to the point where it's fatiguing your muscle and you can't lift another ounce, then you come back in 3 days or 4 days, you're going to be a little stronger for it, right? So that's the way to conceive of this. But if we are being stressed on a regular basis or exercising self-discipline constantly, this kind of a thing, then we are going to have less of an emotional bank account. And this is where the play comes in. This is our day-to-day. Now, what goes into this container, I would have you think about. Maybe even pause at this point. Get a gold star in your forehead for coming up with the answer. Okay. Now, a hint to help you along would be to say, okay, think of this. If you came along and keyed my car, and every time that I thought of you, boy, I'd get upset by that because I hadn't gotten beyond that. What do we call that? Okay, this is very important. This is an important word and an important notion to consider. So if you're tired of me beating around the bush, can't blame you. The answer is resentment. Okay, anything that is unresolved from our past is a resentment. And there's a very good saying that goes, resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Think about what that means. Think about whether you agree with that or not. Okay? So if you keyed my car and you're out there just doing whatever other crappy stuff that you do in life, then my being upset by you doesn't bother you, but it is taking up space. And I'm not saying that it's going to put me over the edge. It's just a drop in the bucket. But, there's that drop, and then there's the resentment that I had for moving all over the place, and the resentment that I had for authority figures, and the resentment in particular that I had for my mother, which took up a lot of space, because she was the person who I essentially blamed for all of my misery, having dragged us all over the country and down into Mexico. And my sense of things was that she, if it weren't for her, my life would have been a whole lot better. And certainly I wouldn't have started drinking at 10 and doing drugs at 12, 13 and being angry and all the other things that went with it. Well, so while that has a monumental value in understanding that if I can embrace the truth that all of this stuff that goes into my being upset, my container being full, is a resentment, and resentment's this poison. And keep in mind, like for my mother, it's not like she went around worrying about how much she upset me. She was convinced that she was a great mother. As a matter of fact, her idea of what great life would be for a kid is, okay, you ready for it? Adventure. She thought that all of this stuff, she couldn't have imagined a better deal as a child for herself to be able to go travel around with your parents and go to new places and learn new things, which is great theoretically, but it doesn't work conceptually because kids need stability. Kids need consistency. That was a major flaw in her plan, her thinking around that. But anyway, it doesn't matter at this point because I did the work that I needed to no longer resent her. But it took a long time and it was a lot of work. So let's talk about that. So if you can buy this idea that resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die, the most important part of that is taking poison. If resentment is the poison, what's the cure? What's the antidote? Again, I would have you ponder this. I would have you stop this and try to come to this conclusion yourself. I don't think I would back in the day, but the answer is forgiveness. Now, this is another thing that we aren't taught how to do in our culture. We're given platitudes towards forgiveness, especially since this is more or less a Christian-based culture, and the icon of Christianity, having been, nailed to the cross, saying, allegedly, forgive these people, they know not what they do. And so we're taught to forgive. We also have this forgive and forget thing that a lot of people just like, that doesn't work for me. No, I think that's absurd. I think that the idea of trying to forget about something that is so upsetting to us that we have to work on forgiving is not going to ever happen. You forgive and you move on. You don't forget, and especially if you're still being violated by whoever you're needing to forgive, then, it's really, really hard to do. Now, there are strategies. There are ways to do this. I have my clients look up YouTube videos, TED Talks. If you aren't familiar with TED Talks, they're a great source of usually cutting-edge information. Technology, education, and design is what that stands for. And you go there and you enter forgiveness and see what's new, see what's worth listening to. Google, see what's worth listening to. Now, the following strategy, I don't know if I came up with myself, probably not, but I don't remember where it came from, and it works. And the strategy is to imagine the person who you have resentment towards. Okay, this is a meditative exercise. So It really works the best, in my estimation, if we're sitting in silence, sitting in a way that is, a sacred posture, sitting up straight, perhaps legs crossed or feet flat on the ground. This grounds us, is the idea. And you imagine the person that you have resentment for, and you surround them in white light. Call that white light love. Okay? Whether you're spiritually minded or not, this is going to work. Okay? And I'll tell you psychologically why it's going to work in a minute. If you are spiritually inclined, then, all the better, in my opinion. Conceptually, we can say that all love comes from the source, and the more that we give it away, the more that we have it to give away. Think of anybody that's real stingy with their love. They usually are not very loving people. Think about people that give away love all the time, not looking for anything in return. They are usually very loving people, and this energy attracts itself. You cannot make anybody love you, but you can be loving. And when you are loving, that energy attracts itself. Now, so it's really, really hard to surround somebody that you have a resentment towards with white light and call it love. And the idea, by the way, is calling it love and detaching from the outcome, right? You see, this is saying, I wish you love and healing and good things for yourself no matter what, right? It's not like you have to ask me for your forgiveness, or you have to apologize, water under the bridge. That, the work is to do this until you no longer have negative feelings towards that person when you are thinking about them. That's your gauge. If you have a thought about a person and you start getting worked up because of that thought, then that is not a resolved issue. Okay. Now, about the science behind it. If you aren't spiritually minded, still the science is solid that when we have a thought, then our rational mind will justify the thought. Okay, so if you have negative thoughts about people, let's say a particular race or the opposite gender or whatever it is that you have negative thoughts towards, when you think of those people or see those people, you will see reasons to justify your upset with them. Okay, if you have love towards somebody, it's real easy to see and be reminded about what is loving about that person. So when we think about a person that we have resentment towards with white light, call it love, detached from the outcome, then our brain starts to go, oh yeah, well, maybe they didn't do these things on purpose to us. Maybe if they did do these things, they were, compromised psychologically themselves, or, they have deficits of their own, or they have anger issues, or maybe they were beat on as children themselves, or whatever it is. Our brain starts to go, yeah, well, for whatever reason I am sending them love, there's probably not a good reason for what they did, but a good reason for me to be in that forgiveness, you see. Because I assure you this, whether they're living or not, because don't forget, your resentment towards somebody is not dependent on whether they're around. It's not dependent on a whole lot of that stuff. It's simply a matter of what you're carrying around inside of you. And so as you start to do this work And the better you get at surrounding them in white light, calling it love and detaching from the outcome, the more you will feel it. It's like we learn to carry these heavy rocks that are our burden. And, we start out very young with, very, very small rocks that become bigger and bigger, but either we crumble under the weight of all of those things, or we get strong enough to carry them. And when we get strong enough to carry them, we kind of assimilate to that, and we, in fact, forget that we're carrying around this weight until we start chipping away at it. And when you start chipping away at it, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to notice the difference. And there's no downside to learning to forgive people. Now, there used to be, and there's a magnificent scholarly treatment of the evolutionary reason for both resentment and forgiveness. It's called Beyond Revenge, The Evolution of the Forgiveness Principle. Very worth reading. Like I said, it's a scholarly treatment. I'm pretty sure the guy was head of his department, social psychology in Florida, something. And he pulls together anthropology and psychology and social psychology to explain why it would be an evolutionary advantage for a person to have resentments. This is part of our DNA. It's part of what makes us human. And, there was a pretty famous therapist, Catherine Horney, spelled horny, but, they like to go with Horney, who, started to postulate this idea that if you have resentments, that's bad, and it kind of like snuck into the culture. It's not a bad thing, it's a normal thing. It's part of our DNA, it's part of what human beings would have to do. Now, it's also part of our DNA to be forgiving. And so learning about the reasons for all of that is pretty great. And, what I'm going to do now is call this the first step, the first installment, and then next installment will be about the ABCs of REBT. My throat is holding up all right. And this is part of the thing, you guys. What I wanted to do, knowing that this is really some of the best therapy that I do, the best teaching that I do is around this information. I really wanted to get it out there before my throat goes south. It's, talk about pain and self-discipline and all that. I mean, I'm not trying to be snivelly, but, it hurts. And this is a effort of passion to try to get this information out there before I'm not able to share it. So, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen starting Tuesday when they start to do the radiation, but my sense of it is that it's not going to be bad for the first week or two. Weeks 6 and 7, and then the 2 weeks following the treatment are supposed to be pretty rotten weeks. You probably won't hear me talking then. Anyway, you'll hear me talking after this. Bye.